The call came in just after 2:40 a.m., the kind of hour when the city feels unfinished. Lower Wacker Drive was empty when I arrived. Concrete sweating from the cold, exhaust hanging low like breath that refused to disperse. Traffic above sounded distant, distorted, as if filtered through water. My boot scraped against asphalt, dusted with salt, and something darker I didn't want to identify. The body lay near a support pillar, positioned too neatly for an accident. No signs of a struggle. No panic frozen into the face, just stillness. What struck me first wasn't the blood. There wasn't much, but the clothes. A wool overcoat, threadbare and damp. The cut unmistakably old. Shoes with thin soles, cracked leather. A hat crushed beside the head, felt eaten away by time. They smelled wrong, not decay exactly. More like old paper and metal, something stored too long underground. I crouched and checked the skin. Cold, but not long dead. A day, maybe two. The face looked ordinary enough, but the longer I stared, the more it felt out of place, like a photograph slipped into the wrong album. Above us, the city kept moving, unaware. Down here, time felt stalled, pooled on the asphalt, thick and unwilling to drain. I remember thinking, before I even stood back up, that this wasn't a murder scene. It was a mistake. Back at the precinct, fluorescent lights flattened everything, even doubt. I trusted rooms like that. Paper, screens, systems that pretended the world was orderly if you asked it the right way. I logged the evidence myself. Photographs, clothing samples, prints lifted from skin that shouldn't have matched anything modern. The computer hummed, thinking harder than I wanted to. The hit came back clean, too clean. Full match. Name, date of birth, last known associates. Thomas Torino. Mid-level. Prohibition era. Disappeared winter of 1929. Presumed dead. Body never found. The file was thin, yellowed at the edges where someone had scanned it decades too late. I checked the timestamp twice, then ran it again. Convinced I'd misentered something. Same result. Same man. I stared at the screen until the letters stopped looking like words. There was no flag for hoax, no annotation warning of historical anomaly, just a quiet confirmation, as indifferent as gravity. I pulled the physical archive box myself, dust rising as I opened it. Old reports, typed unevenly, notes written by men long buried. The photograph inside matched the face from the tunnel. Younger, but not by 90 years, by hours. Procedure told me to escalate, to assume fraud or system contamination. Instinct told me something else had slipped through, using our records like a doorway. I closed the box and signed the evidence log with a hand that felt unfamiliar. On paper, the truth was consistent. That frightened me more than if it hadn't been. I didn't sleep after that. I lay on my couch listening to the building settle. Pipes ticking like something counting time wrong. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the face from the tunnel layered over the photograph from the archive, the two refusing to separate. My training told me there was an explanation. My body didn't believe it. By morning, the doubt had settled in, heavy and methodical, not panic. Something colder. I replayed the night frame by frame, searching for the moment I'd misjudged distance or light, or judgment. I checked the photos again. In one of them, taken wide. More habit than necessity, I noticed a shape behind the pillar. Not a person, not exactly a shadow either, just a distortion, like the air had been folded and forgotten to be smoothed out. I asked the tech if she saw it. She shook her head too quickly. Said compression artifacts did that sometimes. Her voice carried the same tone I'd used on witnesses when I needed them to stop talking. On my way back down to Lower Wacker, I caught my reflection in the windshield. For a second, it lagged behind, eyes blinking a fraction too late. I told myself it was exhaustion. I told myself doubt was normal. But standing there again, breathing in damp stone and oil, I realized something had already changed. Not the city, not the case. Me. And whatever I'd found hadn't followed me up. It had been waiting. The clothes came back from forensics sealed in clear plastic, tagged and numbered like everything else that pretended this was routine. I spread them out on the stainless table myself, up close. They felt heavier than they should have, as if they carried time in the fabric. The overcoat was wool, thick and unevenly worn, the lining frayed by decades of friction that didn't match the condition of the body. Buttons dulled by oxidation, stitched with a style I'd only seen in museum cases. No modern repairs, no synthetic fibers, nothing that belonged after the Second World War. The smell lingered even through the gloves. Damp stone. Old smoke. A faint metallic note that reminded me of subway tunnels long abandoned. Not rot, not mold. Preservation. Almost. Like the clothes had been waiting somewhere dry and dark, while the world above aged without them. What bothered me wasn't authenticity. That could be faked. It was inconsistency. The cuffs were threadbare, worn thin from years of use, yet the seams beneath were intact, never stressed. The shoes told the same story. Soles cracked from age, heels barely scuffed, walking without distance, time without movement. I imagined the man standing still, while decades slid past him. Fabric aging faster than flesh. The thought came uninvited, fully formed, and refused to leave. I sealed the evidence back into plastic, my hand slower than usual. Clothes are supposed to tell you where someone has been. These told me where he hadn't, and how long he'd been nowhere at all. Surveillance is supposed to be impartial. Cameras don't forget, don't hesitate, don't lie to spare themselves. That belief had carried me through years of night shifts and ugly scenes. I requested every feed that touched Lower Wacker for a 4-hour window and watched them alone in the review room. Lights off. Screen glow painting the walls a sick blue. The footage showed the roadway empty. Pillars. Drainage runoff. Occasional headlights sliding past the upper levels like ghosts that didn't know they were ghosts. At 2:11 a.m., something flickered near the pillar where the body had been found. Not a person entering frame. Not a collapse. Just a brief compression of space. Like the image had inhaled and forgotten to exhale. Then the next frame showed him already there, lying exactly as I'd found him. No arrival, no movement, no origin. I slowed it down frame by frame until time lost meaning. Pixels bled into one another, edges vibrating softly, in one feed, for half a second. There were two bodies in the same place, slightly misaligned, one sharper than the other. I leaned closer, breath fogging the glass, heart sinking to the playback speed. When I called it up again, the anomaly was gone. Clean footage. Empty asphalt until my headlights appeared. The system log showed no edits, no drops, no corruption, just continuity. I signed off the review anyway, noting no usable visual evidence. That was true in the strictest sense. The cameras hadn't seen anything, or they had. And whatever it was had learned how not to stay recorded. Writing the report felt like translating a language that didn't want to be understood. I chose my words carefully, sanding down anything that sounded uncertain, anything that hinted at impossibility. Time of discovery, condition of remains, environmental factors. Each sentence was technically accurate, yet the sum of them felt dishonest. Like a map drawn after the landscape had already shifted. I caught myself omitting details without deciding to. The smell of the clothes, the absence of arrival on camera, the way the body looked placed, not dropped. None of it fit into the correct boxes, and the form didn't ask for explanations, only conclusions. I gave it what it wanted. Probable homicide. Cause pending. No suspects at this time. Halfway through, the cursor began to lag. Just slightly. Letters appearing a fraction of a second after I pressed the keys. I paused, listening to the room. The soft whine of the hard drive. The distant hum of ventilation. When I scrolled back up, a sentence I didn't remember typing sat between two paragraphs. It described the body as temporarily displaced. I deleted it immediately, pulse quickening, and ran a system check. No intrusion, no autosave anomaly. I printed the report and signed it, the pen leaving a deeper groove than usual. On paper, everything looked settled, official, closed. But as I slid the pages into the file, I noticed faint impressions on the next sheet down, like pressure marks from words written long ago and erased too often. Documentation is supposed to preserve truth. That night, it felt like something else was using it to practice remembering. I went back alone, off the clock, wearing a jacket without a badge. Lower Wacker at night has its own weather, air heavier, colder, carrying the taste of rust and old water. I walked the stretch where the body had been found, counting steps, forcing the scene to line up with memory. It didn't. The space felt longer now, the pillars slightly farther apart, like the road had stretched when no one was watching. I noticed the grate near the wall because it wasn't on the maintenance map I'd memorized years ago. Rectangular, cast iron, its bolts worn smooth, as if handled too often by bare hands. Warm air breathed up from the seams, carrying a smell I recognized from nowhere in particular. Damp stone, smoke, something mineral and ancient. I knelt and brushed away salt and grime, revealing a pattern worked into the metal, not a symbol, more like a rhythm, repeating in uneven intervals. When I pulled, the grate opened without resistance, no alarm, no protest from the hinges, just a hollow sound as it tipped back, exposing a ladder descending into darkness that didn't reflect my flashlight properly. The beam seemed to shorten the farther it went, swallowed by angles that refused to settle. I stood there longer than necessary, listening. No voices, no movement. Only a low vibration underfoot, subtle enough to question whether it was real. I thought about procedure, about backup, about all the reasons to walk away. Then I stepped onto the first rung. The grate closed behind me with a sound that felt final, though I hadn't heard it move. The ladder ended in a corridor that shouldn't have fit beneath the street. The ceiling arched too high, the curve uneven, as if it had been shaped by pressure rather than design. Brick walls leaned inward at inconsistent angles, forcing the space into a subtle funnel that made my depth perception unreliable. My light crawled across the surface instead of illuminating it, shadows folding back on themselves. The bricks were old, older than the city pretended to be. Not uniform, not standard. Some were hand-cut, others fused with a mortar that smelled faintly of sulfur and wet clay. In places, the pattern broke entirely, giving way to stone that looked carved rather than assembled. Tool marks ran along it in spirals that never quite repeated. I traced one with my glove and felt a vibration, like distant machinery that had learned to breathe. The corridor branched without warning. No signage, no logic. Angles bent just enough to hide what came next. I realized then that the space wasn't designed for movement in straight lines. It wanted wandering. Correction. It expected it. Sound behaved badly down there. My footsteps returned delayed, overlapping, sometimes arriving before I'd placed my foot. Somewhere deeper. Water dripped with an irregular cadence, out of sync with gravity. The air grew warmer as I descended, pressing against my chest, carrying layers of history I couldn't separate. I'd seen forgotten infrastructure before, disused platforms, sealed tunnels. This was different. This wasn't abandoned. It was unfinished. And as I moved forward, the walls seemed to settle, as if acknowledging my presence, adjusting themselves just enough to make turning back feel theoretical rather than possible. I heard it before I understood it as music, a vibration more than a sound, threading through the tunnels and into my bones. At first I thought it was machinery, old generators buried and forgotten, but it had a swing to it, a lopsided rhythm that rose and fell without settling into anything stable. The further I walked, the clearer it became, notes bending in ways that made my teeth ache. It was jazz, or something wearing jazz like a memory. Brass tones stretched thin, percussion arriving half a beat too late, melodies looping back on themselves as if unsure where they belonged. The sound didn't travel in straight lines. It pooled in corners, slid along the walls, disappeared entirely when I faced it directly. When I turned away, it grew louder, confident. The tunnel opened into a wider space, and the music thickened, filling the air like smoke. I could feel it in my chest, pressing against my heartbeat, nudging it off tempo. For a moment, my pulse matched it, and the sensation was deeply wrong, like letting something else decide when to breathe. I realized then that the music wasn't echoing. There was no clear source. It existed everywhere at once, stitched into the architecture itself. The walls hummed faintly, bricks resonating at different pitches, turning the space into an instrument tuned to an alien scale. I thought of speakeasies, of hidden rooms and whispered passwords, and felt a sudden, irrational certainty that if I followed the sound, I wouldn't just find a place. I would arrive at a time that no longer needed me to be had from anywhere else. The first person I saw down there was smiling, and that was how I knew something was wrong. Not because smiles don't belong in dark places, but because his arrived too slowly, like it had to remember the shape. He stood near the edge of the wider chamber, half lit by bulbs that buzzed with a tired, amber glow. His suit looked period authentic at a glance, suspenders stretched over a chest that rose and fell out of sync with his breathing. When he stepped closer, the detail slipped. His eyes weren't level. One sat slightly higher, tracking me a fraction of a second behind the other. His teeth showed too many surfaces, overlapping where they shouldn't, catching the light in a way that made counting them feel unsafe. His hands bent strangely at the knuckles, joints doubling where bone had decided to reconsider itself. Others emerged as the music softened. Men and women, shapes that read as human until they didn't. Limbs carried extra angles, necks turned farther than anatomy allowed, then corrected themselves as if embarrassed. Their voices, when they spoke, were polite, careful, each word chosen like a borrowed object. I felt the urge to announce myself, to default to authority, but the impulse died before it reached my mouth. Badges belonged to surfaces. Down here, I was the one out of place. Their clothes told stories of decades layered poorly, 1920s cuts, 1940s shoes, something modern stitched through like a mistake. They watched me with an expression I recognized from interrogation rooms, curiosity edged with restraint. Not hunger, assessment. One of them nodded, slow and deliberate, as if acknowledging a condition rather than a person. In that moment, I understood that whatever they were, they hadn't changed by choice. They had adapted, and I was standing in a room full of people who had learned how to survive being wrong. They called him Moses, though I doubted it was the name he'd been born with. He sat apart from the others at a table scarred by decades of use, fingers resting flat on the wood as if to remind himself of its solidity. Unlike the rest, his proportions were almost correct. Almost. His face held its symmetry with effort, the way an old building does after too many winters. He spoke without urgency, his voice low, textured, carrying an accent that didn't anchor to any one place or decade. He told me he'd gone underground in 1929, chasing a shipment that never arrived. Time, he said, had folded shortly after. Not broken. Folded. He described days that lasted minutes, years that passed between breaths. Above us, he said, the city kept aging. Down here, it waited. Moses explained that some of them changed more than others. Those who resisted the drift, the sense that up and down, then and now, were negotiable, didn't last. The body compensated when the mind couldn't. Extra joints, misaligned features, adjustments, survival written into flesh. When I asked why they stayed, he looked at me with something like pity. There was nowhere to go. The tunnels led to versions of the city that no longer recognized them. The surface rejected inconsistencies. Down here, the rules were looser. He leaned in slightly and lowered his voice. The music, he said, wasn't entertainment. It was a warning. A pressure change. Something deep was stirring. Something older than the structures that held us. The city had been built to bury it. Layer by layer. Lie by lie. When it wakes, Moses said, eyes steady on mine, time stops pretending. I realized then that he wasn't telling me a story. He was giving me context, whether I wanted it or not. Time behaved differently after that conversation. Or maybe I'd just lost the ability to ignore it. I checked my watch out of habit and found the second hand dragging, pausing between ticks like it was weighing its options. Moses noticed and gave a thin smile, the kind meant to prepare you for disappointment. He showed me a wall where dates had been scratched into the brick, dozens of them layered over one another. Names followed some of the numbers, others ended abruptly, as if the writers had been interrupted mid-thought. The earliest was from the 1890s. The latest was from 3 years ago. The grooves still pale and fresh. Moses said those marks had been made within the same afternoon. I felt the pressure then, a subtle compression behind my eyes, like descending too fast without equalizing. Breathing required attention. My thoughts began to overlap, memories sliding out of sequence. I recalled events I was certain hadn't happened yet, conversations, smells, conclusions already drawn. The sensation wasn't disorientation. It was convergence. I asked how long I'd been there. Moses shrugged. Long enough for you, he said. Not long at all for us. He gestured toward the others, who now moved through the space with a practiced ease, stepping around things I couldn't see. Their gestures anticipated obstacles, as if the room rearranged itself in advance. When I turned toward the corridor I'd come through, it seemed shorter, the ladder impossibly close. I understood then that descent wasn't measured in distance. It was measured in how much of the surface you were willing to let go. And something beneath the city was very patient about waiting for that moment. Moses led me through a narrower passage where the walls blackened, brick giving way to stone, scorched smooth by an old, deliberate heat. The smell changed there, ash ground into mineral, smoke that had settled so deeply it no longer rose. He said this was as close as the tunnels came to memory. I thought of the Great Fire, the way it's taught as catastrophe and rebirth, a clean break between what was and what came after. "That's the story," Moses said, reading my silence. "Not the reason." He explained that after the fire, the city didn't just rebuild, it lifted itself, layer by layer, raising streets, burying foundations that didn't fit the new narrative. "Ancient structures," he said. "Not ruins in the romantic sense, but frameworks. Older than Chicago. Older than names. The fire gave them permission. Ash made forgetting respectable." I ran my hand along the stone and felt grooves that heat alone couldn't have carved. Symbols worn down to intention. Channels cut to redirect something that wasn't water. Moses said the city learned early how to lie to itself, how to call containment progress. The fire wasn't an accident, not entirely. It was useful. It created the excuse to cover what had been uncovered too soon. Every raised street, every new foundation pressed down like a hand holding something under. Above us, generations walked, slept, lived entire lives, unaware they were standing on a correction. Below, the pressure built, patient and silent. Moses stopped and faced me, his expression steady. "Lies work," he said, "until time stops agreeing." I understood then that the fire hadn't erased the past. It had sealed it, and seals, eventually, fail, beyond the scorched stone. The geometry changed again. The floor dipped, then leveled into a surface too smooth to be brick, too warm to be natural. It felt manufactured, but not by hands I could picture. The walls opened into a vast support chamber, and for the first time since descending, I felt small in a way that had nothing to do with distance. Pillars rose from the floor at irregular intervals, their shapes subtly asymmetrical, tapering where no weight demanded it. They weren't holding anything up. They were holding something apart. The material was neither stone nor metal, but something in between, veined faintly with a dull, internal glow that pulsed slow enough to question whether it was alive. Moses told me these foundations predated the lake, predated the glaciers. The city hadn't been built on solid ground. It had been built on a compromise. These structures marked boundaries, limits set by entities that understood pressure and depth better than time. Humans hadn't designed them. At best, they'd imitated them, stacking brick and steel above what they couldn't move. I noticed grooves worn into the floor, paths carved by repetition rather than erosion. Something had passed through here often. Something large enough to displace air, but careful enough not to leave obvious damage. The thought tightened my chest. Moses said the foundations weren't meant to imprison what lay beneath. They were meant to negotiate with it, hold it in a state of partial alignment with reality. But alignment required maintenance, attention, belief. We had stopped paying. As I stood there, the faint pulsing quickened, just slightly, as if reacting to observation. I realized then that the foundations were not inert. They were listening, and above them, a city of glass and steel trembled, unaware of how thin its certainty had become. Moses didn't describe the merge as an event. He called it a condition, something that happened when boundaries grew tired of holding. As we stood among the foundations, the air began to feel layered, like overlapping drafts moving in different directions at once. My ears popped, then adjusted to a pressure that had no source. I saw it first in this distance, a streetlight, impossibly out of place, flickering into existence between two pillars. Then another, older, its glass yellowed, casting a weaker glow that overlapped the first. Two versions of the same space occupying the same coordinates, neither fully solid. When I shifted my weight, the floor responded twice, once immediately, Once, a heartbeat later, the music returned. Thicker now, weaving through the chamber, pulling at the edges of things. Moses said sound was the easiest bridge. Rhythm didn't care about dates. It only needed repetition. The merge, he explained, was different. Chicago's bleeding together, past, present, possibilities that had almost happened, when enough of them aligned. Reality lost the argument. I caught glimpses of movement that didn't sync with my actions. People walking through the chamber wearing clothes from decades apart, unaware of one another. A train rumbling past where no tracks existed, its roar phasing in and out of silence. For a moment, I saw the city drowned, towers broken by water that reflected an unfamiliar sky. My head throbbed as the images stacked, refusing to resolve. Moses gripped my arm, grounding me. "Don't try to understand," he said. "Understanding pulls you apart." I realized then that the body on Lower Wacker hadn't traveled through time. Time had reached out and brushed against him. And now, standing there, it was brushing against me. The kid went missing on a Tuesday, the kind of detail that sticks because it's so unremarkable. 23 years old, camera always on, chasing abandoned places for views. His last upload showed him laughing, breath fogging in the cold, promising his subscribers something no one had ever seen. 6 hours later, he was found beneath a service road near the river, wrapped in plastic sheeting that hadn't been manufactured in decades. I was pulled back onto the surface fast, the tunnels receding behind protocol and paperwork. The body told the story before the autopsy could. Skin desiccated, drawn tight over bone, eyes collapsed into dark hollows. Mummified. The pathologist said weeks, maybe months. Time of death. Impossible to narrow. I watched him talk himself into explanations he didn't believe. I reviewed the footage from the kid's camera myself. The final minutes glitched heavily, audio stretching, image almost smearing as if the sensor couldn't agree on exposure. In one frozen frame. His face was split by two expressions, fear and relief, stacked imperfectly. Behind him, a doorway opened onto brickwork I recognized, though it shouldn't have been anywhere near the river. Officially, the cases weren't connected. Different victims, different circumstances, unrelated anomalies filed under separate departments. But I could feel the compression again, that subtle pressure behind the eyes. The merge wasn't contained to the tunnels. It was reaching up, sampling. The kid hadn't gone looking for history. He'd stumbled into alignment, caught between versions of the city that disagreed on how long he was allowed to exist. And whatever waited below had learned something important. People on the surface were starting to notice the gaps. The audio was worse than the video. Sound survives damage in ways images don't. I listened through headphones in an empty office, door locked, volume low enough to pretend I could stop if I wanted to. At first, it was just wind and breathing, the kid narrating to an audience that would never answer him back. Then the distortion crept in, stretching syllables until words became elastic. Underneath it all, there was another voice, not loud, not clear. It threaded through the recording like a second frequency, surfacing only when the primary track faltered. I isolated it, ran filters, cleaned what I could. The voice didn't resolve into language. It mimicked cadence without meaning, pauses falling where conversation expected them to be. When I slowed it down, the pitch dropped into something that vibrated in my chest instead of my ears. I checked missing persons databases out of habit, searching for a match I knew wouldn't exist. None did. The voice didn't belong to anyone currently alive. That wasn't speculation. It was certainty. The same kind I'd felt looking at the gangster's file, a closed system confirming something it shouldn't. As I listened again, I noticed the kid responding to it, answering questions that never made it onto the track, nodding, laughing at the wrong moments. At one point, he said, "Yeah, I hear it," and the voice surged, briefly overpowering his own. I removed the headphones and sat in the silence, aware of my own breathing, the hum of the building. When I played the file through speakers, the secondary voice vanished entirely. Some things, I realized, only speak when they're close enough to be mistaken for thought, and I had listened too carefully. It became harder to tell where the work ended and the symptoms began. I missed small things first, misplaced keys, unanswered emails, meetings I was certain hadn't been scheduled yet. My reports came back with red annotations that didn't feel earned. Supervisors asked if I was sleeping. I lied with practiced ease. The cases kept stacking, each one containing a fracture too clean to dismiss. Witnesses aged between interviews, skin loosening or tightening in ways lighting couldn't explain. One man's voice deepened overnight, his birth date shifting by 3 years in the system without any record of amendment. When I pointed it out, the clerk stared at me like I was inventing problems. I started keeping my own notes, handwritten, because digital files felt unstable. Even then, sentences rearranged themselves when I wasn't looking, margins filled with impressions, half-formed diagrams I didn't remember drawing. The act of documentation, my anchor, was becoming unreliable. The breaking point came during a briefing. A crime scene photo flashed on the screen, and for a moment, everyone else vanished. I saw the room layered, one version older, smoke-stained, another sleek and renovated, both occupying the same space. My pulse spiked, and the image snapped back, leaving me gripping the table to steady myself. They put me on administrative leave that afternoon. Stress, they said. Burnout, suggested counseling. Time away from the tunnels, as if distance could fix misalignment. Walking out of the building, badge heavy in my pocket, I understood something fundamental had failed. Not my sanity. Not yet. It was the assumption that the world I worked to protect was singular, stable, and agreed upon. That belief had been procedural, and procedure had finally run out of jurisdiction. Dr. Elizabeth Crane didn't look like someone chasing the end of the world. Her office sat on the 23rd floor of a glass tower overlooking the river. Clean lines and controlled light, every surface intentional. She had been flagged in an internal memo I wasn't supposed to see. Consultant, historical preservation, structural anomalies, a category vague enough to hide almost anything. She listened without interrupting as I described the tunnels, the foundations, the way time folded instead of flowed. When I finished, she didn't question my conclusions. She corrected my vocabulary. What I'd seen, she said, wasn't decay or collapse. It was desynchronization. Chicago existed in overlapping states, and certain structures were designed to keep those states from converging. She pulled out blueprints that didn't match any public record. Skyscrapers I knew well, rendered with hidden layers and stress lines that had nothing to do with wind or load. Anchors, she called them, metaphysical in function, architectural in form, built to pin reality in place, to keep one version of the city dominant. The problem was maintenance. Belief eroded. Renovation stripped out obsolete features. What had once been intentional became decorative, then optional. The anchors were slipping. Crane leaned forward, lowering her voice. There was an original breach, she said. Older than the city, beneath the Art Institute. The anchors drew stability from it, but the flow had reversed. Instead of containing overlap, they were feeding it. She met my eyes then, expression calm but unyielding. "Someone has to go down there," she said. "And someone has to understand what they're resetting." I realized she hadn't called me for my badge. She'd called me because I was already out of alignment, and because I'd proven I could survive it so far. Crane took me to the rooftops at dusk, when the city's edges softened and the skyline pretended it was coherent. From above, the buildings looked steady, glass and steel aligned against the lake. Up close, the lie unraveled. She pointed out hairline fractures running along decorative elements, stress marks dismissed as cosmetic, but mapped precisely along invisible fault lines. I felt it before she finished explaining. A low vibration underfoot, subtle enough to ignore if you weren't listening for it. The same resonance I'd felt beneath the city, now echoing upward through steel beams and elevator shafts. The anchors were still functioning, but unevenly. Some pulled harder than others, creating tension that manifested as accidents, disappearances, misreported times of death. Crane showed me data, power fluctuations, unexplained acoustic anomalies, micro delays in synchronized clocks across the city, individually meaningless. Together, a pattern of drift. The anchors were no longer in agreement about which version of Chicago they were stabilizing. As night fell, the lights across the city flickered out of sync. Not enough for panic, enough to notice if you were looking. I watched reflections in the glass double, then settle, then double again. For a moment, I saw streets that didn't exist, bridges leading nowhere, the lake pressing farther inland. Crane said the system had always required intervention. In the past, it was hidden behind fires, floods, rezoning. Now, the margins were gone. The city had grown too complex to quietly correct. "Stability isn't permanent," she said. "It's maintained." I understood then why I'd been feeling the compression more frequently. The anchors were losing their grip, and reality was testing alternatives. The city wasn't breaking. It was deciding which version of itself deserved to remain. The entrance wasn't marked, which felt intentional. Beneath the Art Institute, past storage rooms and climate-controlled vaults. Crane led me to a service corridor that curved just slightly enough to distort distance. The walls were newer here, poured concrete layered over something older that pressed through in places like bone under skin. The air changed as we descended, cooler, heavier, carrying a faint mineral tang that reminded me of the foundations. My ears rang softly, adjusting to a pressure that had no measurable source. Crane said the breach had never been sealed, only redirected. The building above wasn't a barrier. It was a lid. We reached a chamber that didn't register as a room so much as an absence. The floor dropped away into darkness, edges defined by a ring of inlaid metal that hummed at a frequency I felt in my teeth. Faint light pulsed from below, illuminating fragments of architecture suspended at impossible angles. Columns, street signs, bits of sidewalk hanging as if caught mid-fall. Crane explained that this was where alignment began, where versions of the city negotiated dominance. The anchors drew from this point, stabilizing one outcome at the expense of others. But the flow had reversed. The breach was widening, pulling probability inward. As she spoke, I saw movement in the void, layers of the city sliding past one another, out of sequence, a parade dissolving into traffic, a future skyline flickering and vanishing. The sensation was overwhelming, not fear, but vertigo of meaning. Crane stopped at the edge and looked back at me. "Once you go in," she said, "you won't come back the same way." I believed her, because standing there, listening to the breach breathe, I realized something had already crossed over, and it hadn't waited for permission. Officer Sarah Kim started seeing things before anyone realized what was happening to her. At first, it sounded like stress, headaches, double vision, trouble focusing during night patrols. Then she mentioned recognizing streets she'd never driven, knowing which traffic lights would fail seconds before they did. I paid attention because I'd learned the cost of ignoring patterns. When I met her, she looked exhausted in a way sleep wouldn't fix. Her eyes tracked the room unevenly, adjusting to details that weren't stable. She told me she sometimes saw people twice, once as they were, once as they had been, or would be. The versions didn't overlap cleanly. They drifted, like reflections on moving water. She described the city as layered, not broken. Some days, she said, she could see old storefronts bleeding through modern facades, hear languages that hadn't been spoken there in decades. It wasn't constant. It came in waves, usually after long shifts near the river or the older infrastructure. She thought she was losing her mind until she realized the visions were consistent. Sarah didn't panic. That was what frightened me. She approached it like a problem to be managed, cataloging discrepancies, learning which perceptions to trust. She said the hardest part was realizing that what she saw wasn't hallucination. It was excess information. When I close one eye, she told me quietly, the world simplifies. When I open both, it argues with itself. I recognized the compression in her voice, the careful control. She was partially merged, straddling alignments without collapsing. Useful, dangerous, temporary. As she spoke, I noticed something else. When Sarah looked at me, her gaze lingered, like she was counting. Later, I asked what she saw when she looked my way. She hesitated, then said, more than one ending. Sarah's condition worsened in increments small enough to rationalize. Nosebleeds that stopped as soon as they started. Moments of absence where she lost seconds. Then minutes. She documented everything, filling notebooks with careful observations, dates that no longer lined up with official time. She said the more she saw, the harder it became to decide which version of events deserved her loyalty. Crane explained it clinically. Perception wasn't passive. To see multiple alignments was to participate in them, to stretch the mind across incompatible states. Most people snapped back to baseline, their brains rejecting inconsistency. Others adapted. At a cost. The human body, she said, was not built to arbitrate reality. Sarah described it differently. She said it felt like standing between two conversations, trying to answer both without offending either. The pressure built behind her eyes, down her spine, settling into her joints. Sometimes she woke up older, muscles aching as if she'd lived an extra year overnight. Other mornings, she felt lighter, faster, like parts of her hadn't arrived yet. I watched her hands tremble when the city lights flickered. She started wearing earplugs off duty, not to block sound, but to reduce choice. The music from below reached her sooner now, faint rhythms slipping into her dreams. She told me she could feel the breach when she was close, a tug, like gravity with intent. Crane was blunt. Partial merging was unsustainable. Eventually, Sarah would either collapse into one alignment or be pulled apart by the strain. Treatment could slow it, not stop it. Sight couldn't be unlearned. Sarah accepted this with a calm that felt earned. If seeing costs something, she said, then not seeing does too. I understood then that the city didn't create witnesses by accident. It selected them, and it never did so without collecting payment. Sarah made the decision before anyone asked her to. That was the hardest part to accept. We were standing near the river at night. City lights fractured across the water. When she told me she already knew where the breach would pull hardest. Beneath the Art Institute, the place where alignments argued the loudest. She said she could feel the anchors slipping, each one vibrating at a slightly different frequency. It hurt to listen to, like a chord that never resolved. Someone had to go down there and hold the resonance steady long enough for the system to reset. Not forever, just long enough to force the city to choose. Crane laid out the parameters later, careful and detached. The process required a human presence already partially aligned, someone who could tolerate overlap without immediate collapse. Survival wasn't part of the equation. Neither was return. Sarah listened without flinching, eyes unfocused, tracking things only she could see. I argued. Procedure, ethics, anything that sounded official enough to matter. She let me finish, then shook her head. She said the merge had already marked her, that she was living borrowed time, stretched thin across outcomes. This way, she could decide how it ended. There are versions of me that walk away, she said quietly. They don't fix anything. When she looked at me, I saw it too. Possibilities peeling off her like reflections. Some afraid, some already gone. She chose the one that stayed. Later, alone. I realized the truth I'd been avoiding. The city didn't need volunteers. It needed anchors, and Sarah had become one the moment she started seeing clearly. The decision wasn't heroic. It was inevitable. The chamber beneath the Art Institute was larger than memory could hold. It unfolded as we entered, space adjusting to accommodate what it needed to contain. The floor was not level, but layered. Sections of street, stone, and soil suspended at different depths, each belonging to a different era of the city. Gas lamps burned beside LED fixtures, their light overlapping without blending, casting double shadows that refused to agree. Sound behaved like weather. Footsteps echoed ahead of us before we moved, then arrived again after, delayed and uncertain. I could hear traffic, applause, distant sirens, all out of sequence, rising and falling as if carried by unseen currents. Sarah stood at the center, steady despite the visual noise, her posture aligning with the room in a way that made my skin prickle. The walls were not walls, but boundaries. Curving surfaces of stone and metal etched with impressions of buildings long gone. Names surfaced and faded as I tried to read them. Dates slipped when I focused. I felt the compression there stronger than anywhere else. The pressure of too many outcomes insisting on relevance. Crane stayed near the entrance, her presence already fading at the edges. She said the chamber represented convergence, the point where the city's histories negotiated dominance. No single version was meant to exist there for long. The strain showed in the air, which shimmered faintly, vibrating with unresolved motion. As Sarah stepped forward, the layers responded, shifting, aligning briefly around her. For a moment, I saw Chicago as it had been, as it was, and as it might become, stacked like transparent sheets. The chamber wasn't a place. It was a decision made visible, and it was waiting for someone to finalize it. Crane handed us the tuning forks without ceremony. They were silver, heavy for their size, etched with markings that hurt to look at for too long. She said sound was the only constant the alignments agreed on. Frequency could pass where matter failed. The forks weren't tools so much as keys, cut to fit a lock that refused to stay still. When Sarah struck hers against the stone, the note rang out clean and sharp, slicing through the layered noise of the chamber. My fork followed, the vibration traveling up my arm, settling into my chest. The air responded immediately, rippling outward in visible waves. The overlapping lights flickered, then slowed, sinking reluctantly to the tone. The music from the tunnels surged, drawn toward the resonance like iron filings to a magnet. It warped as it approached, shedding rhythm, collapsing into a sustained hum that pressed against my skull. Sarah held her fork steady, eyes closed, jaw clenched, as if bracing against a physical force. I felt the chamber resist, timelines pulling in opposite directions, each insisting on primacy. The sound deepened, the vibration intensifying until my vision blurred. For a moment, I couldn't tell if the noise was coming from the forks or from inside my own head. Sarah staggered but didn't break tone. Her outline began to blur, edges doubling, splitting into near-identical versions that snapped back together with each pulse. She was acting as a bridge, forcing incompatible states to resonate long enough to cancel one another out. Crane shouted instructions I barely heard. "Hold, don't adjust, let the frequency do the work." As the resonance peaked, I understood what Sarah was giving up. The sound wasn't just aligning the chamber. It was deciding which version of her was allowed to remain. And the answer was already leaning toward silence. The moment didn't arrive all at once. It thinned. The chamber's noise receded in layers, like water draining from a basin, leaving behind a pressure that hummed quietly with satisfaction. Sarah's fork vibrated one last time, then went still in her hand. The sound collapsed into silence so complete it felt engineered. She looked at me then, eyes clear for the first time since I'd known her. The overlapping outlines were gone. No doubling, no drift, just one version, sharply defined. She smiled, small and tired, as if relieved to finally fit inside herself. The air around her began to fold inward, not violently, but with purpose. The layers of the city peeled away from her form, slipping past like transparent sheets. I reached for her without thinking, my hand passing through a chill that bit deeper than cold. There was resistance. Then none at all. She didn't fall or fade. She aligned. Her outline thinned until it matched the vibration of the chamber, then slipped between pulses, disappearing in the spaces sound couldn't occupy. The tuning fork clattered to the floor, the noise impossibly loud in the quiet that followed. The chamber stabilized, lights resolved into one spectrum, the walls settled, impressions flattening into undecorated stone. The pressure lifted, leaving my ears ringing in its absence. Crane checked instruments I didn't recognize, nodding slowly. The breach was closed, she said. Or rather, reset. One outcome chosen, the others dismissed. I stood where Sarah had been, staring at the empty air that still felt shaped like her. There was no body, no trace, no record the system would ever acknowledge. She hadn't died. She'd been edited out, and somewhere in the city above, clocks resumed agreeing with one another, unaware of what had been erased to make that possible. On the surface, the city corrected itself with unsettling efficiency. Traffic patterns smoothed out. Power fluctuations disappeared from the logs. News cycles moved on. Anomalies downgraded to clerical errors or quietly forgotten. Chicago resumed its practiced rhythm, confident in its own continuity. I walked familiar streets that now felt rehearsed, buildings holding their shapes without shimmer or overlap. Reflections behaved. Shadows agreed on direction. Even the air seemed lighter, as if a pressure front had passed unnoticed. People complained about the cold, the commute, the usual things. No one mentioned missing hours or déjà vu that lingered too long. Sarah's name vanished from the system within days. Personnel files returned errors. Her desk was reassigned. When I asked about her, I was met with polite confusion, the kind reserved for questions that don't fit policy. I learned quickly to stop asking. The city had chosen a version of itself that didn't include her. Crane sent one message before going silent. Alignment restored. Anchors holding. Monitor only if symptoms return. There was no acknowledgement of cost, no space for grief. Stability had been achieved, and stability doesn't invite reflection. At night, I stood on bridges and watched the water move under the lights, waiting for the distortion that never came. The lake kept its distance. The skyline stayed put. Everything behaved as it was supposed to. That was the problem. Normalcy felt fragile now, like a performance maintained by consensus. I understood then that the city hadn't been saved. It had been selected, and selection always implies alternatives, pressed just far enough out of sight to be denied. I went back to work knowing I'd never trust the surface again, because below it, something still remembered the versions that lost. They reassigned me quietly. The way departments handle liabilities they can't formally acknowledge. Transportation Division, night shifts, infrastructure patrol. Officially, it was experience. Unofficially, it was containment. I didn't argue. Some part of me understood the logic. If something drifted again, I was already close to the fault line. The tunnels felt different after the reset. Quieter, but not empty. The music was gone, replaced by a low, steady hum that reminded me of breathing slowed to a deliberate pace. Walls held their angles. Corridors no longer rearranged themselves when I wasn't looking. The city beneath the city had been disciplined, not erased. I walked routes that never appeared on public maps. Flashlight beams steady, radio silent. Occasionally, I caught reflections that didn't match my movements exactly, lagging by a fraction of a second before correcting. Enough to notice, not enough to report. There were signs of habitation, old chairs, discarded cups, chalk marks half scrubbed away. But no people. Moses was gone. The others with him had either slipped back into alignment or somewhere less cooperative. The tunnels had closed ranks. I logged each patrol meticulously. Timestamps precise, language conservative. Procedure mattered again, even if I knew better. The act of recording was a form of respect, a way of acknowledging what lay beneath without inviting it to answer. Sometimes, when I paused long enough, I felt a familiar pressure behind my eyes, a faint echo of compression. It never fully manifested. The anchors were holding, just barely. I realized then that this assignment wasn't punishment. It was surveillance, not of the tunnels, of me. And I accepted it, because someone had to stay close enough to notice when normal stopped being honest again. The lake was calm the night I understood it wasn't finished. From the service tunnel that angled toward the shoreline, I could feel the water pressing above and beyond the concrete, a weight that didn't shift with the tides. Sound traveled strangely there, every drop amplified, every movement answered by something slower, deeper. I stood at the barrier where the tunnel stopped pretending to be human-made. Beyond it, the walls curved inward, smoothed by methods erosion couldn't explain. The air was colder, carrying that same mineral scent I'd first noticed weeks ago. Not decay, preservation, patience. Nothing moved. That was the point. The presence beneath the lake didn't announce itself. It didn't need to. It existed the way gravity does, constant, unbothered by attention. I understood then that the merge hadn't been an attack. It had been a reminder, a test of whether the city still remembered how to hold its shape. The anchors would fail again someday. Not dramatically. Gradually. Belief would erode. Maintenance would be deferred. Someone would decide an old structure was obsolete, and the layers would begin to drift. Soft at first, then insistent. I wrote my final note of the shift and shut off my flashlight, letting the dark settle naturally. In that silence, I felt it listening, not to me, but through me, measuring the surface by what it allowed to be forgotten. I turned back before curiosity could harden into invitation. Because I knew the truth the city refuses to print in any report. Nothing beneath Chicago is asleep. It is waiting, and it has all the time we keep borrowing.